He said, well, what would you like me to do? And he said, well, I feel bad asking for stuff because I've never talked to you, but could you do something for me? He said, of course. He said, well, could you at least make the grizzly bear a God-fearing Christian? And God says, yes, it's done, no problem. So the bear stops, the atheist stops, and the atheist is breathing a huge sigh of relief when he sees the grizzly bear fold his gigantic paws and bend his huge head and begin to pray. Dear Lord, for the meal that I'm about to receive, make me truly grateful. So one of my few spiritual atheist environmental jokes. At any rate, a pleasure to be here and pleasure to be part of the new Integrated Sustainability Initiative at Trinity College, made possible by the generous gift of the Lawson family and wonderful people they are indeed. In looking at COVID and the climate emergency, I view these as diagnostic moments. What is a diagnostic moment? Well, when you experience a diagnostic moment, you've approached a stark boundary. It becomes clear that you're headed for very unsavory consequences unless you make some definite and dramatic changes. Think of going to your family doctor for your annual checkup. After all the blood work and sundry tests are in, your doctor has some stark news. Unless you lose weight, radically change your diet, cutting out those burgers, fries, Boston cream donuts, yum, and Panzerotti, lose weight, lower your cholesterol, and start a regular and serious exercise routine, you're on the way to a heart attack, a stroke, heart disease, diabetes, or all of the above. In other words, if you don't change your act, it doesn't look good. This is not a terminal sentence, however, but a diagnostic one. Your doctor informs you that you can still turn things around, provided that from this day forward, you make a serious commitment to changing your lifestyle. In other words, you are a key player in the process. You have agency here. You've been confronted with some pretty forceful evidence of impending catastrophe. It's clear that you simply can't just pop a pill and magically get well. You realize you have to be fully engaged, physically, mentally, psychically, in your own recovery. In so doing, you enter a spiritual space where your attitudes, practices, habits, psychic energy, and resilience are critical to your future. As we head into the Christmas season, one is reminded of one of the most famous diagnostic moments in literature. Charles Dickens's Ebenezer Scrooge, on his way to a lonely death and hellish afterlife, is given a soul-shaking diagnostic moment by three Christmas spirits, and he is transformed from soul-pinched miser to giddy do-gooder. With our contemporary climate emergency, or what might be called climate chaos, it is not an MD, but the Earth itself who is talking to us. And the Earth is speaking to the entire human community. The data from the scientists is clear. The test results are confirmed, and the results are not sanguine. Mother Earth is telling us that we are in a severe crisis. That voice of the Earth is also asking us some pointed questions. What is our role here as a human species? What is the vocation of the human? What is our purpose and place? How are we going to respond with compassion and with justice to widespread species loss, whipsawing weather patterns, rising sea levels, plastic in our waters, and chilling climate change? All of human hands, and often economically privileged hands. What on earth are we doing? These questions are not only personal and societal, they are indeed spiritual. In responding to this diagnostic moment, both our spirit and spirituality have to be part of the recovery plan. These twin crises of the pandemic and climate change show that our human health is deeply tied to planetary health. Ultimately, there is no firm demarcation between persons and the planet. There are several spiritual dimensions to this awareness. The first is ontological. We are realizing that the ecological crisis and the pandemic are asking us to deeply question our cultural anthropocentrism. They're asking us to redefine at the species level what it means to be human. Our cultural anthropocentrism has put the human at the apex of creation. What we're experiencing now is an epidemiological as well as ecological invitation to a new ontology. These point to a crisis in embracing the common good rather than personal gain as the telos of our economic and academic and political systems. We're being invited in our mainstream Western culture to see that we are not isolated monads, but persons in community not only with each other, but with the planet's ecosystems, and indeed with all of creation. The second is justice. As is distressingly clear, COVID-19 and the climate crises run along the same fault lines as social, cultural, racial, gendered, economic, and political oppression. As we have seen here in our own city, Toronto, and as has been detailed by the Toronto Star, marginalized communities, racially and economically, have been hardest hit by the COVID crisis. Internationally, as the climate justice movement has shown, vulnerable and marginalized populations who are least responsible for greenhouse gas emissions are often the ones most negatively and horribly impacted by global climate change. This is a profoundly spiritual concern. The third is personal lifeway. How are you going to live your life and embrace a spiritual practice rooted in joy, love, and hope amidst these pandemic climate change times? This is a call to embrace spiritual practices that not only provide personal resilience and purpose, but also include the more than human world, the natural world, so-called, as a partner in our new spiritual lifeway. How is one going to embrace such a lifeway? What values and traditions would one adopt? For me, love, celebratory joy, and hope are key features of responding to this diagnostic moment. This moment does not simply call for hair shirts, sackcloth, and ashes. It also involves entering into new relationships with our economy, our academy, our faith communities, and our biotic community. In these new relationships, we are invited to fall in love, as it were, with the earth itself, to befriend rather than besmirch our planetary home, our earth, the place where we and all the created world of creatures, flora, and fauna live. Thomas Berry, a cultural historian who called himself a geologian, he was a priest, but one who was reflecting more on the earth as the primary source of our sacred expression, wrote about this time in a book called Befriending the Earth. He writes, "What is happening in our times is not just another historical transition or simply another cultural change. The devastation of the planet that we are bringing about is negating some hundreds of millions, even billions of years of past development on the earth. This is a most momentous period of change, a change unparalleled in the 4.5 billion years of Earth history. All indications suggest that we are, in a sense, a chosen group, a chosen generation. We did not ask to be here at this time. Some of the prophets, when asked to undertake certain missions, said, "Don't choose me. That's too much for me." God says, "You are going anyway." We are not asked whether we wish to be here at this particular time. We are here. The inescapable is before us. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was, as always, such a gift to open and explore and savor. And thank you. I've been taking notes as you've been talking. Just so grateful for your wisdom and your insights. And thank you too, Stephen and the alumni team, for the privilege of being here tonight and sharing with you. I just feel doubly blessed to be able to have this kind of conversation at this time in our history here at Trinity College, at U of T, and as global citizens, both Canadian citizens and global citizens. As I teach a course on COVID this year, I study pandemics. And so you can imagine these days have had both a professional and a personal journey for me. And, you know, one of the things that I'm regularly doing, like a lot of us, is I'm watching those numbers, you know, as they come in, the numbers of people who are suffering and people who have died. And, you know, as I look at Johns Hopkins University website today, who are recording these numbers, I mean, we have 68 million people with COVID, who've had COVID, and 1.5 million deaths in 191 countries. And then as I look at the map, it's fascinating, which I'm not popping up on the screen here, but in communities where you might expect people would have managed COVID well, we haven't. And it is humbling, frankly, to look at their map, if it does not humble us here in quote unquote the North and the West, although, you know, certainly there are problems around the world, but it should humble us. And if you look certainly at a country like Canada, many of us are following our numbers here, but you know, we're looking at 430,000 plus people with COVID, and over 12,862 deaths are what I'm staring at right now. And so, you know, the messaging here is that to echo Stephen's comments here, it could be a gloomy, indeed sobering time. And I find as I talk with my students, both these wonderful students I'm teaching in Trinity 1 and fourth year students, I find them struggling indeed with this reality, this once in a century kind of pandemic that we are living through right now. And it doesn't help when I explain to them that it's possible that because of the decisions we've made with regards to ecology, with regards to the natural and non-human world around us, that in fact we may see more of these kinds of pandemics in the future. So I fear that I have to immediately pivot the mood in the room because indeed the data is problematic. And so it's probably worth saying at the outset, to put it very clearly, this is, of course, a public health problem, but it is first, or at least equally, perhaps is best to say, a matter of the spirit. And it is a matter in which we are dealing with trauma. We're dealing with individual trauma. We're dealing with collective trauma. And I would suggest, as I reflect, Stephen, on your words, it echoes the trauma of the earth and what we have done to the earth and continue to do. And so let's be clear then, the reverse of that is healing, and that there is in fact a need in profound ways for personal healing on this, whether it be the journey around fear of this pandemic, whether it be denial, whether it be a desire to control, and of course, some of these things also play into how we respond, I would suggest, to challenges of climate change and the crisis that we are facing because of the harm we've caused there. So that is first. And collectivity. As a political scientist, I look at at the public spaces that are operating around the world. I mean, you see the global space, and we haven't worked very well together when it comes to the global policy space around COVID response. And indeed, we probably could have a great deal we could learn from our friends in the environmental movement because of the strength of their response, which has gained momentum over decades of painstaking advocacy and collaboration between scientific communities and advocates around these vital issues. And in fact, I think we're talking about it today in part because of the success of those communities, as well as the acute nature of the challenges we're facing. But we've struggled at the global level around advocacy in COVID. We've also struggled. We see our societies when we look, well, one can look south of the border, of course, to our friends in the States. We can see it in Canada. We see it in a number of countries in the world, a fragmentation that emerges across cleavages that were already existing in those communities, but that elements of COVID has brought to the surface. And, you know, it is striking, I have to say, the way in which this crisis has accentuated the divides within communities. Of course, the same token, it can also accentuate those things that draw us together. So it is a choice in how we choose to respond. But I'm thinking here of everything from the anti-mask movements across the globe, certainly, but we're seeing it in very particular communities, to the outrage against lockdowns, and noticing the transition too of that. First solidarity and now impatience. And one of the things that I'm learning as I'm teaching my COVID course, and I look through the history of pandemics, we've seen this before. We've seen these patterns of responses before to previous crises. Despite all of that, I do believe there's hope. And I guess that brings me to my second point. And that is, crisis presents us with remarkable opportunities, whether it be the crisis of ecological change and the destruction that we've caused, the opportunity to change our responses there, or whether it be the crisis of COVID. And I would argue the interconnections with the world around us. And there are lots of opportunities we have, and opportunities primarily to learn as individuals, to allow ourselves personally to be transformed by the journey that we're on, to not fight it indeed, but to embrace this in the context, Stephen, of some of your comments there near the end, that the choice of the personal life way, as I think you put it, what kind of choices we would make, just like a doctor gives us the choice about how we live our lives. We have a choice in how we respond to the circumstances within which each of us find ourselves now. But of course, we have a public choice. We have a profound moment, and it's a moment I would urge us not to waste. And it's a moment where we can see the intersection of these issues that we're talking about today. I would suggest that one of the lessons that must be learned in this moment in history is that what we require is nothing less than a fundamental refashioning of our societies towards more just, grace-filled, and compassionate places. And I include that in that the human and the non-human world, the natural world around us, living in that sort of harmony and that synergy, Stephen, in line again with the comments that you've said there. One theologian refers to this as rightly ordered relationships. You could suggest that our relationships have been profoundly out of whack, badly organized, badly ordered, improperly structured. Our relationships with each other, our relationships with the earth. The challenge, of course, with that is that learning is not easy, right? We're seeing the struggles in our society as people are resisting the unfamiliar. They're resisting the desire to admit wrong. They're resisting the desire, or they're resisting the opportunity to say, no, I will change. I have to change the way we live, whether we look at challenges around climate change, whether we look at challenges around COVID and the difficulties it's presenting to so many of us. But I still believe, my third point, that it is possible. That this kind of transformation is possible, that human life, individuals can be transformed, as well as our political structures and our social structures. I'm not going to suggest it's easy, but I believe firmly that it is. And I think it starts in part in looking at the journeys of those far, perhaps more courageous than I, but looking at some of the work that they've done in policy reform and social reform. I think it starts with listening to those who suffer. It starts at the meeting place of suffering, and not to run from it, but in fact, to receive it, to embrace it, and say, what can I learn? How can I be transformed from this? But most specifically, how can I focus and hear the voices of the marginalized in our communities, those voices that had been systematically ignored? And so that includes, and this is not certainly an inclusive list, but that certainly includes our fellow citizens and colleagues who struggle on matters of socioeconomic status, the poorest of the poor in our midst, those who've been marginalized for a whole range of reasons, whether it be their identities, whether they be members of Black, Indigenous, or other very diverse communities of people of color, whether they be experiencing forms of discrimination because of gender identity, because of any other kind of disability of any kind of issue that puts them at the margins and restricts access to care. This, of course, can also include the voice of the earth, because we have systematically left that voice out of conversation. Because we cannot lead and we cannot move forward unless we first listen to those voices. We simply will not properly transform the world in the way that we need to. You know, Father Henry Nouwen, the Catholic priest, once said, "The great illusion of leadership is to think that we can be led out of the desert by someone who has never been there." And I think we have to go to the desert, and we have to receive the message that we are hearing here, the complex messages. But I think it's possible in part because I've seen people do this, and I'm going to point to a couple cases in pandemics, actually, in global health, just to make reference to the fundamental transformation that has taken place in the public policy community over the past, I would say, 15, 20 years. And that is specifically around programming and financing for HIV/AIDS, and treatment around antiretrovirals, as well as for providing treatment for multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, and also new diagnostics and treatments in malaria. And of course, some of you who follow these conversations globally will know that that links to both the Millennium Development Goals and then now the new Sustainable Development Goals. And it situates those responses within broader discussions of both poverty eradication and walking with deep respect and honoring of the earth. And we have seen just through the MDGs and into the Sustainable Development Goals, a significant transformation of the financial infrastructure away from a kind of exclusionary neoliberal structure towards a modified structure that perhaps doesn't go far enough, I would dare say, but that certainly has placed the poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable, at the center of decision-making around access to essential medicines and gold standard medical care in the case of HIV/AIDS and TB in particular. And I'm referencing the Global Drug Fund for HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria, and a series of other sort of satellite networks and organizations, which have fundamentally changed the incentives around some of the research and some of the work in this area. That said, there's much more to be done on that front, and it's not a perfect story by any means. But the task now is bigger. Bill Gates reminded us that COVID-19 has now eradicated the progress that we made in poverty and inequality over the past 10 years, and it did so in simply a few months. So this is a comprehensive agenda that is required. It's an agenda that no longer sees these issues as polar or pillar, separate sort of towers separate from each other, but in fact, in the spirit indeed of the Sustainable Development Goals, that draws them all together and looks at the intimate connection between humans, the earth, and justice. And I am hopeful, cautiously, that we can use this moment as a catalytic moment. And I'm hopeful, I guess, in part because I've seen some evidence, and we look throughout history, and there are these great moments of change. And previous pandemics have sometimes served as catalytic moments. And when you combine a pandemic with the crisis of climate, I mean, what more powerful moment might we have than this one? So I guess I would leave on that admonition that this cannot be wasted, and what we cannot do is to lull back into a sort of sense that the existing structure and system and ways of doing business ways of thinking about our problems, ways of not collaborating, not listening to each other, and above all, the consistent marginalization of our most vulnerable, those days have to end. They need to end now. You know, in the midst of the challenges that we have here in Canada, I want to just make a couple of points that again bolster my hope on that. If you look at the map in Canada, there are a few places in our country that are doing quite well in managing COVID. And one is many of our maritime provinces, and the other are in Indigenous peoples. And a good friend of mine's a nurse amongst our Indigenous communities. And he came back after serving for a period of time, and he's back and forth right now. But he said, you know, it was interesting when they were talking about COVID in the community that he was working in. I loved the way he worded this. He said, they said to me that we have a deep respect for this virus. And I thought that was a really powerful way of saying it, a deep respect for the virus. They'd heard stories, they knew about the Spanish flu, they knew about, you know, these pestilences that we as settlers had brought upon them. And they have never forgotten that. Those stories have been told down to the children and the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. This matters, this way of thinking about the respect with the earth, and then the respect of a virus and living in a very careful and cautious way matters. So I think we have a lot to learn. And in our friend down in the Maritimes, there is a strong sense of community and public good that many of us who have traveled in those communities or have friends there or are from there know that. And I don't want to idealize anything here, but I think that there's a foundation to work from that you also see mirrored in other countries, like, say, New Zealand, South Korea. My students from South Korea talk about this as well. This sort of sense of a sort of shared responsibility for the other, a shared commitment to walk alongside each other with a deep honoring, a deep respect, a value of human life. So I think I will leave it there, except to say I refuse to be negative. I believe there is hope, and I believe that there is hope for that fundamental transformation, but we have work to do.
Okay, thank you, Joy, and thank you, Stephen. It's a privilege to hear your thoughts on this subject, and I want to thank as well the Alumni Association, Kathy and Maureen, for having me here and for allowing me to contribute my thoughts to this most important discussion at this very critical time. So thank you all. So when the pandemic began, I think that many of us will be able to relate to this, but I had a sense of hope that as a result of the global shutdowns and our way of life as we knew it being completely upended, that our ways of existing in relation to the natural world would change, that it would be this moment of reckoning, so to speak. I thought there would be this recognition that our systems were broken and that going back to normal would not help us. From my view at this point, I think this recognition has occurred in bits and pieces in certain areas, but not to the extent that I had hoped. And as both Joy and Stephen have touched on, I think that collectively we need to view this as an opportunity to rethink our relationship with the earth. And most specifically, from my perspective, with animals and non-human life. Because when we look at what's happened here, COVID-19, as we all know, is a disease that originated with animals. And on a very basic level, this should serve as a reminder to us of how inextricably linked we are with other life on this earth. And that when we cause harm to animals, this harms us in turn. We don't exist above them, and we certainly don't exist in a vacuum. And as Joy mentioned, you know, we've seen this kind of situation play out time and time again. Coronaviruses are zoonotic, meaning they're transmitted between animals and people. And COVID-19 was thought to have come from a live animal market where animals are often sold as food in Wuhan. But the Spanish flu, SARS, MERS, these are also all contagious diseases that jump from animals to humans. And in the past, there was a learning opportunity as well, but we didn't seem to take it. Because what we seem to do is often downplay the nature of the problem. And specifically with COVID-19, we've seen that much of the dialogue about, what went wrong here has surrounded banning live animal markets and live animal markets alone. And in this way, I think what we've seen is a very consistent othering of the problem, in that the dialogue emphasizes that, these kinds of diseases are spread from those uncivilized wet markets that are over there. That couldn't happen here. It's not our problem. And this, of course, as we've seen even in Canadian society, has led to an increase in racism as well. And that's been very disheartening. And this really comes down to the fundamental problem that it's much easier to point the finger than it is to look in the mirror. And we should be doing that here, because Western factory farming and the industrialized production of animals poses these same risks as wet markets. And again, we've seen this before. Animal agriculture has incited global pandemics like H1N1, which was initially called swine flu because it was linked to a similar disease in pigs. But even from this moment, animal agriculture was not really a significant part of the discourse that resulted from everything. And I'm hopeful that in this particular moment with COVID-19 that it can be, and that perhaps this moment will lead us collectively to confront the dangers of industrial animal production head on. Because we have these situations where there is a complete lack of compassion. There's a lack of compassion for animals. There's a lack of compassion for the farm workers. And what it leads to is a lack of compassion for us all. Because when we keep animals in these overcrowded, dirty conditions, it creates a breeding ground for diseases like COVID, not to mention other pathogens and antibiotic resistance, which there's been more dialogue about. But, animal rights organizations have investigated factory farms undercover in recent years to shed light on and to prevent these kinds of irresponsible practices. And what they found is that so often there are downed animals, meaning sick animals that are so sick at times to even stand, that still enter our food system. And these practices, they were defended for decades, even in Canada, until mad cow disease erupted. And then there was an agreement that we shouldn't be doing that with cows, and that sick cows should not be destined for consumption. But this still occurs with other animals in our food system. So again, we've seen that in the past, there has not been a holistic recognition of the problem. It's been, again, just targeting the one specific issue that led to the crisis. And, moving away from food production, we also see that there's been these significant COVID outbreaks on fur farms. Last month, the Danish government, Denmark's the world's largest producer of milk pelts, ordered a massive cull of humans. And we see that here at home now too. There's an outbreak declared at the Fraser Valley mink farm in British Columbia, and those mink are probably going to meet the same unfortunate end. But really what we see is that the production of animals on this massive scale is a breeding ground for disease. And of course, there's also a significant human cost to this, because as COVID-19 and these diseases spreads rampantly in slaughterhouses, this disproportionately affects temporary foreign workers. And I think, again, this is an important moment to recognize that the pandemic has shown that a worst case scenario can develop when essential but extremely vulnerable and undervalued workforces are ignored. So I think that given the scale of the COVID-19 crisis, and again, that this has led to us being forced to rethink the ways in which we live, the ways in which we relate to the natural world, that this does present, as Stephen suggested, a diagnostic opportunity to not just treat symptoms of the problem, but the actual problem itself, which is a fundamental spiritual issue and a lack of compassion for those that we deem inferior to us, such as animals, or those that we choose to other. So I think that as we move forward, what we need to do is think fundamentally about what we want our new normal, so to speak, to look like. And in doing so, I think that there's a call to action that's happening here, and that we must challenge the inhumane and fundamentally risky practices that we see in industrial animal use. And there are alternatives. At this point in history, we have the privilege of being able to invest in lab-grown alternatives and plant-based agriculture for which we can grow crops to feed people instead of animals. And even to, in some ways, return to the past, to go back to smaller scale farming, which would be better for farmers too, because there used to be 300,000 farms in Canada. And now with industrialization, there's only 196,000. So we see that this would actually be better for small economies and farmers as well. And what I'll close with, because I think that this has been a consistent theme running through our discussion today, is that we have to listen. We need to take animals seriously, and we need to listen to them, even if they are, in the human sense, voiceless. Because our families, our communities, and our societies depend on this. And I don't think we need to look very far to develop this kind of a compassionate approach, to be able to engage in this kind of listening, because so many of us have inspiring and mutually beneficial and even life-saving ways that we engage with animals in our day-to-day lives, whether they're companion animals or service animals. Most of us have been touched in some way by these creatures, even if they don't speak with a human voice. So I think that we're at a moment where we are well equipped to do this, and where we're well positioned to do so. And I hope that I'm hopeful that there will be a recognition that animal suffering does not only harm our fellow kin, but it also endangers our own. And that there can be some takeaway from that as a result of the pandemic that we all find ourselves in now.
Well, thank you, three of you. That's a great deal of food for thought, almost a 360 view of all of these issues. My goodness. There's a question that has come in, and let me, I'll read it to you. It's often said that the economy and the environment are not conflicting considerations. How can we balance growth and material wealth with reducing the harm we cause to ecological systems that keep us alive? Who would like to go first on it? I'm sure you'll all have views. Stephen?
I can begin with an answer. That's a great question. I appreciate that question very much. And what's interesting is the word oikos, O-I-K-O-S. It's the Greek word for home or household, but it's the root word for economy, ecology, and ecumenical. In a sense, our economy is our home, our ecology is our home, and our ecumenical spirit is our home. So this is about taking care of our home. So when we look at ecology, economy, and ecumenism, they're all rooted in this oikos, in this place where we live. And it's pretty basic. So we're now realizing that, as many have said, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the earth itself. You don't have a strong economy if you destroy the source of life. You don't have a strong economy if people are dying all over because of a pandemic. This is basic. And, you know, I really appreciate both Joy and Sarah's comments because they help us get a sense of the basic nature here. Moreover, there's been a number of studies showing that during the 2008-2009 meltdown with the bundled mortgage crisis, well, the sector of society here in Canada, and this was delineated by Carol Gore of the Toronto Star, that grew jobs was the so-called green sector. Everyone else was shedding jobs. The future lies in an economic system that works with rather than against the energies of the earth and of animals and of each other. We're learning this. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. Do either of the other two like to comment? I think Stephen's covered an awful lot of ground there and had so much food for thought in these discussions. My goodness.
I think I'll just defer to Stephen, maybe just one brief comment though, on that line, Stephen, just the data coming out now around COVID and finding that, countries who dealt with it properly and in an equitable way were actually flourishing economically, which is just, this sort of statistical expression of exactly that point, that, you can't have economies if you're not caring for people and for the earth. And I would say equitably as well. We have to make sure that the distribution ensures that we reduce poverty and inequality within that context, so that every life is valued, every contribution is valued in kind of radical equality.
And Sarah, I think, yeah, please.
Sorry, I will for the most part defer to Joy and Stephen as well. I think they've covered most of it, but I would just briefly add that again, this presents an opportunity to innovate in a different way than perhaps we have in the past, to create closed loop systems and to create systems that are at their core equitable and compassionate, because inherently they will be more sustainable, and we will not find ourselves hopefully in situations that are this dire in the future if we're required to shift in some way. Have systems that are more adaptable. So that would be what my contribution would be to that thought.
Yeah, it would be wonderful if all of this could be put together and someone and a group of people sit down and look at it from first principles. It would be wonderful that happens. Let's hope that's where we're going to head up. What spiritual practices do you think might be useful in light of these two major crises and figuring out how to go forward? Stephen?
Sure, I can kick that off. And it builds on what both Sarah and Joy have been saying in terms of the importance of listening. I think this is a key political and spiritual practice. And here, the social teaching of many of the Christian communities and other communities is very helpful. And I'm thinking particularly of Pope Francis's Laudato Si, his 2015 encyclical on our common home, dealing with climate change and species loss and our dysfunctional relationship with the earth. And Maureen, this brings in liberation theology, which you were inquiring about earlier. Liberation theology emanating from nations of the South, particularly Latin America in the late 60s, talked about listening to the cries of the poor, as Joy was articulating, that there's a preferential option for the poor of the divine in Scripture, and the church has to reflect that. So what the Pope has done in his encyclical, he's brought together the cry of the earth with the cry of the poor. And he calls this a kind of unified oral experience of integral ecology. So we need an integral ecology that has a kind of preferential option for the most marginalized in the human community, as well as in the biotic community. So this becomes a spiritual practice of listening in nature to the cries of animals, as Sarah is talking about, to the cries of marginalized, but also the wider and beautiful energies of the earth as well. And spending time in nature and attempting to listen to the voices of nature becomes a very important spiritual practice. So how do we engage in that, and where does that flow into policy and pragmatic change, etc.? This whole notion of listening, particularly to those cries, I think becomes a guidepost or cairn on our spiritual journey.
Do either of the other two have any further comment? Otherwise, there's another question that's come in. If you prefer, I just go on to the next one. Stephen, I think you gave quite a complete indication on that. Thank you. Have we been saved by science too soon from any real lesson to be learned from the pandemic? Do we still, and maybe even more so, expect science to save us, pain-free from the climate crisis? Who would like to start on that? Joy, would you like to go on that one?
Sure, I'll start. I'll talk on the COVID side, perhaps, and then defer to Stephen and Sarah, perhaps, for additional insights. No, I don't think we've been saved by science. I do think that we're given minds for a purpose, and that is those gifts intellectually, and the exploration of science is not separate from the spirit, that it can be directed by the spirit for grand purposes, just like politics can be, in fact, directed by the spirit for grand purposes. And so, I mean, just as a quick kind of recap, no, we are, in fact, it's not going to be a quick and easy, get me a vaccine and this problem is over. No, there's going to be a lot of behavioral change that will be needed over a period of time. And the underlying drivers that we've pointed out are still present. And so we will be back in this same spot again, and maybe even sooner with the same pandemic. But I think, you know, I don't see these things as either or in terms of the role of science and the role of that listening that Stephen is talking about. I see those two things as actually deeply intertwined. And you see this, by the way, in the lives of great scientific researchers, as well as in the lives of people who've sought to live public lives that have been very faithful. And these are people often of deep faith who are seeking to live in a way that is other regarding both to the earth and to their fellow human beings, and that have that disposition of listening. And I would just also add, with the disposition of listening, of course, is the implication of humility. It's that I don't have all the answers. It's not popular in an academy where we like to have it together, right? But I don't have all the answers, and I can be transformed. And there's the rub. So I have to be transformed as part of that process. As the former director of the World Bank said once when I was interviewing him, he said to me, this is Dr. Jim Kim, he said, "You cannot serve the poor unless you first learn to be transformed by them." And I think that the scientific process should be in part about that.
Thank you. Another question has come in. I know we're really running tight to time, but I think it would be useful to have this one answered as well. I've heard many people, including yourself, speak about the importance of compassion during the pandemic. In the past, I typically heard people mention the importance of empathy during difficult times. Have you noticed this shift from emphasizing empathy towards emphasizing compassion? Emphasizing compassion. Why do you think this shift has taken place? Thoughts? Joe, you look like you can hardly hold your mouth closed.
Go for it. Sarah, I'd love to hear both of your responses to that.
Yes, I agree.
Sarah, go for it if you'd like to respond.
You can say no if you don't want to.
Well, yeah, I think it's an interest. No, I was just going to defer to Joy because she looked like she had something to say. But no, I think it's an interesting question. Has there been a shift in the dialogue from, you know, discussing empathy to discussing compassion? And it may be because empathy requires too much of us. It requires us to be able to have been.
I think you're freezing. I'm sorry. So I think you've frozen. We're going to miss what you had to say. Maybe we should go on to one of the others, and then we'll go back to Sarah once it comes.
Yeah, maybe Joy could share her thoughts at this point, and we'll come back to Sarah if she gets unmuted.
Sure. Empathy, I think, it comes out of lived experience. It comes out of a journey of suffering with the other. Compassion sometimes has difficulty in making that good. So it probably depends on where people sit on this journey. I would say walking my mom through the final days of her life gave me an empathy for someone who fights for their life at that stage and who struggles with leukemia, for example, in a way that I wouldn't have had before. But I do think that there is a process there of lived experience that distinguishes the two. I would also say, I think that the world is full of some very compassionate and empathetic people, even in times not of crisis. And that you'd expect that comment from a non-governmental organization worker's daughter. But we see a lot of people in crisis, it brings it to the surface. But I think there's a strong foundation of both empathetic and compassionate people in our world who consistently support a lot of the efforts we're talking about.
Sarah, if you're back with us, why don't you complete your answer, please?
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. I'm not sure when I got cut off, but what I was just trying to say is that I think that perhaps the reason why there's been a shift from the dialogue being about empathy to compassion is because empathy maybe asks too much of us at times. We can't always necessarily empathize with and completely understand those who are suffering or going through difficult times. You know, not every human can empathize with a farm animal that's suffering or empathize with an individual with whom they've never been in a similar circumstance. But we can always have compassion. We can always have, I guess, sympathy in some sense and understand that even if we don't know exactly what that suffering feels like or understand the magnitude or gravity of it, that we can still treat others with sensitivity and delicacy and with care. So I think that's perhaps why that is the ask now, because it's an easier thing to ask of people in a moment like this.
Thank you. I'm not sure how people are feeling about timing. I know we're just a little bit over, but there are two more questions that I think we should probably answer if we possibly can, if everyone's comfortable staying on. The first one is, what institutions, religious perspectives or practices, political beliefs or ideologies, academic disciplines, artistic and cultural movements can help us better see the othering of nature, of animals, of the oppressed, of the market workers of Wuhan, and offer a framework for understanding and action for us to stop this othering? What role could Trinity College membership play in this? Tricky questions, but I think one that deserves an answer. Who would like to start on this one?
Well, I can begin, and I hope that I will be joined by the chorus of Joy and Sarah quickly. Great question, by the way. And I think this, in terms of Trinity, I think this can happen and is happening in a sense in our programs, in our educational approach. I know Joy has employed a very creative and transformative pedagogical style, as of other educators here, that help introduce a different way of learning, of engagement, of mutual support, of listening to each other, but being engaged with these wider issues without othering others in that process. We are now through the Truth and Reconciliation process in various countries, South Africa, now Canada, et cetera, trying to engage in something of that conversation. Long way to go, obviously, but still bringing to our attention voices that have been marginalized, sublimated, colonized, and oppressed. And now realizing in humility that we have to have another way of listening. And I think listening comes into this as well. And the humility attitude that Joy had mentioned as well, very important here. And so we're seeing some of this dialogue in certain religious institutions, academic institutions, et cetera. So part of what an educational institution can do is to begin to model a different way of learning. And I'll pause there and let others chime in. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Sarah, would you like to comment on this question?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that this goes back a little bit to what I was talking about, and just the importance of being able to recognize our own flaws and not just necessarily point the finger and other the problems that we see, because this is really just a defense mechanism that I think people use in times like these. And it's unfortunate, as Joy mentioned, that there has been so much fragmentation that has resulted from this moment of crisis, and that is the default. But I think that there is an opportunity for us to actually come together and recognize that these problems we're encountering are not specific to a certain place, time, or culture, but rather just part of the human condition, and that we all have the ability to learn from one another in that way.
Joy, any words on the subject?
Well, very, very briefly, I find myself in complete agreement with my colleagues here, with Stephen and Sarah, but simply that I think the process of listening for me in part involves a journey of prayer, and that slows me down and takes away the tendency to want to control, which is the problem for me. And I years ago, I had a doctor also say to me, spend time in nature. It reminds you of your position in the universe and your position before God. It was again, back to that kind of place. But I think too, we have a great opportunity here as we think about moving out of this, and we think about celebrating the kind of cacophony of diversity, the beauty of this world, of this natural world, of our fellow human beings who have such different perspectives, identities, and spaces they inhabit. And maybe it's learning to just hear them and hear their stories, so that we can then learn from each other, learn what draws us together, as well as learning what separates us. And that can find its political expression, and has indeed at certain times in certain policy spaces. But it comes from a deeper place, even I would argue, than a political ideology. Although I do think it finds expression in different ideologies.
Thank you. The last question is, how would we both prevent Indigenous communities from being further marginalized as a result of COVID, but also learn from Indigenous ontology? Who would like to go? Stephen?
Sure, I can begin at least with a piece of that question, which is very, very critical and important. With the Integrated Sustainability Initiative at Trinity that has just been launched, part of the emphasis is to include voices that have been marginalized, including Indigenous voices. So exploring partnerships with Indigenous voices and Indigenous communities, and providing a place where the dialogue can happen in an honorable and respectful way is one of the goals. So connecting with communities, Indigenous, that have been articulating a cosmological connectivity that we've often pushed to the margins of our consciousness, but now are re-welcoming in a way that's like, there's great insight here. This is very important. In fact, the whole notion of future generations and thinking of future generations, at least in North America, has tremendous antecedents in the Iroquois Confederacy and the 7th generation principle. This has now been adopted in Sustainable Development Goals, thinking of future generations in terms of these issues. But this was part of the Iroquois Confederacy, and the whole notion of one out of many, e pluribus unum, comes out of the peacekeeper of the Iroquois Confederacy. So part of it's an historical retrieval of the importance of Indigenous lifeways and cosmologies for our own democratic traditions, and part of it's a continuing, in humility and honesty, attempt to listen to and learn from and respectfully partner with Indigenous communities with us in our midst and around Canada and the world.
That was a pretty complete response to that, Stephen. Would either of the other two of you like to say anything further on that subject?
Yeah, just briefly, I want to say I appreciate the question because I do think that there's so much opportunity here to learn from Indigenous ontologies and ways of thinking and relating, specifically from what I study with animals. I'm currently in my research right now looking at the differences between commercial and Inuit sealing. And, not to romanticize or make blanket statements about Indigenous relationships with animals, but what I'm seeing in this particular case is that even though animal use is still occurring, it occurs with fundamental respect and with a regard for the animal as an individual rather than as one of thousands. And I think that there's something, very valuable that we can learn from that in terms of the fact that it's not realistic that our use of animals is going to stop overnight, but instead it can shift. And I think we need look no further than situations like that to learn how we can do so in Western culture as well.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Thank you all very much. This has been quite an enlightening and mind-stretching experience to hear such three different perspectives on such critical issues. Now, I really, really appreciate your efforts. Thank you very much. And thank you to the audience for coming and asking those wonderful questions. It's been a real pleasure. So I think this is pretty well the end of things for now. We're concluding our evening, and really thank you all. And I look forward to seeing you all virtually in the new year, and have a happy, happy holiday, everyone. Good night.
Night.